Amen. All right. All righty. Well, we are in Matthew chapter 27. We're gonna be through with Matthew in a few weeks. I don't know where we're going after that. I mean, it's so many good books of the Bible to pick from as to what we want to study. So we need to be in prayer concerning that and over the next few weeks. But we're looking back at the crucifixion of Christ. And if you'll turn to Matthew 27, we began this study last week. This is part 2 of that study, the wickedness of the crucifixion. And last week, we looked at verses 27 through 37. And that was identifying the ignorant wicked that were there at the cross. And those were typified in the Roman soldiers. Verse 27 on to verse 37, it emphasizes their work and their cruelty that they project against Christ. One thing that was interesting about that was that they really had no bones to pick with Christ. They had no animosity from him whatsoever. To them, Christ was a non-issue. He had not ministered to them directly. He had not confronted them about their sins. These were the Roman soldiers that, because it says that in verse 27, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him, emphasizing that these are the soldiers that are detailed to Pilate himself. Pilate did not live most of the time there in Jerusalem. His chief residence was in Caesarea along the Mediterranean, a much more comfortable setting, and that's where his main abode was. But he had a home. He had a place that he would come to Jerusalem. He would come to Jerusalem throughout the year, mainly on days that were significant, such as the time of the Passover, whenever there would be so many Jews there at Rome. And as he traveled about, he carried with him what was called the cohort. The cohort was a number of 600 soldiers that were assigned to Pilate. These were the more professional, the more skilled, the more capable soldiers. They were basically his bodyguards. And it says that the soldiers of the governor took Jesus. And so he assigns to his own chief soldiers the assignment of the crucifixion. And there are 600 of them that are gathered there, which is more than enough to do what they're doing. But they take Christ, they strip him of his garments, they put a scarlet robe. This comes after his beating, by the way, after he had been scourged, and that was horrific. And after doing so, they bring him into the praetorium, into Pilate's judgment hall, and there they begin to mock and ridicule him. They take a crown of thorns, they place the crown of thorns on his head. They take a reed, they put it in his hand. They take most likely one of the Romans' robes, and it says here that it was scarlet. In Mark's account and John's account, it speaks that they took a purple robe. So it was probably a red crimson robe that had faded to purple. And they placed it on him, and they knelt down in mockery, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And they spit on him. They took the reed and began to beat him on the head, and they mocked him. Then after doing this until they had tired of such, they then put his garments back on him and took him away to crucify him. While on the way to crucify him, there's one that is compelled to carry the cross of Jesus, a man named Simon, who was from Cyrene, who was in the city, and so they pressed him into service to carry the cross, and then they march him up to a place called Golgotha, which means, literally the word Golgotha means place of a skull, and there they nailed him to the cross. Prior to nailing him to a cross, they took vinegar mixed with gall and to give him to drink. The gall was made from an herb. It was made from myrrh, which was a herb that was used as a perfume, but also when it was extracted, the oil from it actually acted as a sedative. And it was to sedate him, not because they wanted to give him any comfort whatsoever, but because this was the way that they dealt with prisoners when they were nailing them to the cross. They would sedate them to make them a little less resistant to what they were doing at that moment. It would soon wear off. But when Jesus begins to taste it, he doesn't drink it. So in other words, he tastes it, spit it out, because he is not going to have anything to sedate him. He is going to feel the full ramification of the crucifixion. He is not going to offer himself even the slightest comfort whatsoever. He is going to drink from the cup that the Father gives him, not from this cup. And in so doing, he takes upon the full wrath of the cross and the full suffering that it would entail. It says after they crucified him, after they nailed him to the cross, take that cross and place it in the ground with a heavy thud that would probably jar him against those nails in his hands and nails in his feet. And that would be excruciatingly painful. Then they began to take his garments. So they strip him naked. He is totally humiliated in every degree. This is the absolute depth of humiliation that Christ is going to experience. There he is suspended between heaven and earth. He is visible for all to see. He's stripped of everything. He is beaten. And there is no one there to offer him any comfort whatsoever. In Psalm 69, it says in verse 20, reproach has broken my heart, and I am so sick. And I looked for sympathy, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none. He also gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. There was absolutely no sympathy given to Christ whatsoever. And we talked about the ignorant wicked that were there, those that really had no animosity towards Christ. They had no reason to demonstrate this kind of maltreatment and sadistic torment upon him. But within the realm of human hearts, we have that capacity. We have the capacity to inflict great hurt and harm on other people. And I honestly believe that if it were not for the restraining work of God in every person's life, that the base nature of man is to replicate that kind of evil. Here, that is not restrained in any degree. So out of the human heart, even the heart that doesn't have any reason to act this way, is demonstrating this. And in all reality, it's not Christ that has been put on display here as much. I'm speaking from Matthew's viewpoint. Matthew doesn't view the crucifixion primarily from Christ as John does. If you study John's account of the gospel, it really talks about all the scripture that is being fulfilled throughout the crucifixion. It's taking it from the vantage point of God's view. Here in Matthew, it's taking it from the vantage point of the people that are doing the crucifixion, the people that are gathered there. And so here, Matthew is more or less putting on display the human side of the crucifixion, the despicable wickedness there. And he starts off by a group of people that really do not have any purpose served. There's no vengeance in their heart that they're wanting to pour on Christ. Now, as it progresses, we see that there are people there that are acting out vengefully. It ends with the final group of people that were the religious wicked, and they have great vengeance in their heart. Remember what Jesus had done in Matthew chapter 23, when through that entire chapter, on the Wednesday before his crucifixion, his final day teaching in the temple, and he gives those great woes. 8 different times he says, "Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites." And he lists their sin. He makes it obvious what their character is. He speaks it publicly in the temple. And this must have burned them. This must have angered them. This must have hurt them to the quick. And so here, they're acting out in vengeance. They're acting out in anger and animosity. But those Romans did not possess this. Yes.
The possibility that what the Romans are doing solely is a scripted thing. The Romans want to make this something of an example.
It may be.
Of this thing, and they're actually kind of just doing a.
This may be something that they do every time, but it still depicts the inner part of man. Even if it's being demonstrated to anybody other than Christ, it's still not projecting a sympathetic, caring type of humanity there. It looks to me as though they're enjoying it, as though they're taking great sport in it, though that they enjoy their mockery and their belittling of this man who is like a sheep before his shearers. And in fact, I honestly believe that this becomes obvious to them themselves. Ultimately, we're going to see that some of these from the Romans are going to acknowledge Jesus as being the Son of God. It says that the centurion at the foot of the cross, when the earth shakes after the sun has gone black and it comes back, he ultimately says immediately after Jesus gives up the ghost and after he dies, he says, surely this man was the Son of God. And it says in Mark's account of that they, many of them, not just the one centurion, glorified God by saying, this is the Son of God. So there was the centurion and there were others. And the fact that Mark says they glorified God in that is more than just making a obvious statement. By glorifying God in that, it gives the indication that this may have been a turn in their own lives. They could have possibly become believers. And I have to believe that God is using the very fact that they have treated him with such harsh despicability. The one thing that is totally unique about this crucifixion that is not like any other crucifixion they've ever examined. Of course, there's many things. I mean, they probably had never seen the sun go dark 3 hours during a crucifixion. They probably never saw the earth or felt the earthquake at the end of a crucifixion. Those are unique. But you want to know something that I think is even more unique than that? Is the fact that Jesus never spews out any venom to those that are doing this. And you got to imagine that when somebody is being treated this way and someone is dying on the cross, that their own personal anger and vindictiveness to them would cause those. They probably heard every form of profanity. They probably heard every vile word. They were probably spit on if they came in the vicinity of one of these people that were hanging on the cross. And this was probably common. They grew to expect that. They grew to know that this is the way people are going to react when put in a situation. But when they hear Jesus say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, this is unlike any other person they've ever taken. So you see the contrast of the wickedness makes even the brilliance and the glory of God even greater. Because against the backdrop of human depravity and human mistreatment of any other human comes the kindness, the mercy, the generosity, never once spewing out a vengeful statement out of his mouth against either the accusers that led him to the crucifixion or those carrying it out. I have to believe that this had a big, major bearing on those people seeing the difference there. Sometimes, and you have to say this, the encroaching darkness, the wickedness, is like the darkness before the sun went out. What they see in this wickedness coming out of their life is absolute spiritual darkness and spiritual blackness. We're living in a nation that is losing its morality faster and faster every day. Every day our nation is taking on a new nature that all of us are old enough to remember what this nation was like when we were children, what human life was like, how we treated one another, how we I'm not talking about perfection. I'm not talking about there was no crime. I'm talking about the fact that some of us never even locked our houses because we felt safe and secure where we were at. Now we won't drive down to the local grocery store without making sure we got the house locked and the alarm turned on. I can remember when I was first saved in 1975, we had a new pastor come to our church in West Texas in Seminole. And he bought, this is the first time that our church ever had any musical instruments. He was a new pastor, about 25 years old, and his wife and him sang, and they had drums, they had guitars, they had everything, and they brought it with them. They bought some, they put a new PA system in the sanctuary, and all of this. I mean, this was unusual. This was, that almost caused a revolt right there, but nevertheless, they put it in there. That wasn't the issue, bringing in these musical instruments. What was the issue was, once he filled the sanctuary with all this expensive equipment, he went and had locks put on the church door. For the first time in the history of that church was locked when nobody was there. And he almost lost his job. They almost fired him because of the audacity of locking a church. And their thought was the church should be open so that anytime, day or night, anybody that wanted to go there and pray. Well, the problem was nobody did. You know, he came back and said, that's wonderful, but I've never seen anybody up here after dark. I've never seen anybody up here taking advantage of that. And he said, this is too valuable of stuff for somebody to come in and walk out with. And so they finally acquiesced. He put locks on the door. I became a pastor when I was 25 years old. I was pastoring in San Antonio, came here to San Antonio on the south side of town. They already had all the musical instruments. They already had the great PA system when I got here. And not only that, they had a wonderful alarm system on the church. One day, I left the church one night. The following day, one of the deacons showed up and the church had been left unlocked and the alarm system had not been turned on. And I almost lost my job because I didn't lock the church and I didn't have the alarm. And there's not more than about 7 to 8 years of time that passed from one pastor almost losing his church because he locked it to another pastor almost losing his church because he didn't lock it. That's how quickly things change. And when we see this kind of morality or immorality encroaching in our nation, one of the common thoughts that we feel, one of the common ways of vocalizing what we see is we see this being incredible spiritual darkness encroaching in our nation. The lack of morality, the lack of care, the lack of spirituality, the lack of reverence, the lack of fear of God, all of these things, one way to basically verbalize it is this is spiritual darkness. You'd have to say it's a much darker world we live in today than we lived in 50 years ago. Let me tell you something. The darker it gets, the better the light. Even the smallest light stands out even better in a darkened world. Never let that make us think that that makes us less useful, or the darkness is going to keep us from demonstrating the truth and the light of the gospel. And on the day that the world was at its pitch darkness, it was spiritually dark, it was morally dark, and then God, on the stroke of noon till 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he made it absolutely physically dark. But in the midst of that, the brightness and the glory of Christ shine even greater. No matter how despicable his treatment is, and no matter how he is ridiculed, mocked, and all these things that are demonstrated against him, does not diminish his light. He is the light of the world that came to light every man's life. You'd have to say that this is satanically induced. You would have to say that this is not only satanically induced, but it is grasped and followed willfully by those here on this earth. They're willful agents of Satan to carry it out. But in spite of the fact, or wherever the source comes from, It does not. Remember, he is the light that the world could not comprehend, could not overcome. And at this darkest moment of Christ, he still stands out. So in spite of that, now we see that as a result of that, they crucified him, they begin to part his garments, they strip him naked, and at the very end of that, they take that placard that was placed over every criminal. Every criminal would have a description placed over their head while they were being crucified. And by the way, they would take the criminal and place him where Golgotha is a place where a highway will pass by. It's elevated, it's up on a hill so that it can be made visible. The reason being is the Romans wanted to advertise crucifixion. They wanted it to be a deterrent against further crime. And so they would place it in a busy thoroughfare so that everybody coming and going would have to see what was being done. One of the reasons for that is because naturally, this did not create among the Jews a great spectator of people to come and see somebody crucified. Think of that. Now, I know that there are times in our history, I think that in the Wild West, when they did a hanging, it was like an all-day affair, and people would come out to watch them. That might have been in our culture. But it wasn't among the Jewish culture that they would go and they would take and make a day of watching somebody suffer. So if they held it in a place, even in a large venue, people would vacate that area because that's what was going on. This is normally not a place where you have a lot of people gathering to see somebody die. The only people that would normally gather at a time of a crucifixion would be family members of that individual or friends of that individual. Quite possibly there might be somebody there that if that individual had committed a crime that they were the victim of, they might be there for that purpose, but you wouldn't see a large number of people there ordinarily that weren't connected to it in some personal way. And those that would normally be there, such as the friends and family, would be there so that they could comfort that loved one while they were dying, not agonize that loved one, not make their life miserable, because the misery of the cross was sufficient. I mean, everything that the cross had already done, even the brutalization and the humiliation that the Romans would inflict upon them, that was sufficient. The Jews did not see them needing to do anything to further that. And yet, at the time of Christ's crucifixion, we not only see the passerbys going by, but we also see that there are many of the chief leaders of Israel that are there as well. This is not where they would normally be. In fact, they would have always considered this beneath their dignity to attend the crucifixion of even the worst criminals in their society. And yet, they are there at the cross. This is interesting. This is unlike any, though crucifixion was common. I think we read last week or the week before that up until the time of Christ, there had already been something like 30,000 Roman crucifixions in Israel alone, mostly due to insurrections that had taken place over the years. This was not uncommon, but everything about this crucifixion is absolutely uncommon. So, interesting that it says in verse 37, and above his head they put up the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus." Go to John. I think it's in John chapter 20. Maybe chapter 19. Let me see. Just a moment. Yes, John chapter 19. Verse 19. Well, let's look at verse 18. There they crucified him, and with two other men, one on either side, and Jesus between. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It was written, "Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews." Note that Matthew doesn't mention the fact that he said Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. Verse 20, therefore many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew and in Latin and in Greek, the three most common languages of that area. Hebrew for the Jews, Latin for the Romans, and Greek for the Gentiles that would be in and out. So 3 languages had that inscription placed there. As I said, this was common practice. Whenever someone was crucified, not only did they place their cross where it was visible, but they also wrote above their heads what crimes they were guilty of. If they had raped, or if they had murdered, or if they had stolen, or if they were part of an insurrection, that would be the placard above their head. But Pilate doesn't put a crime. It is a crime and it's not a crime. This was the charge that they had against Jesus, not the original charge. Remember, the Jews voted to have him crucified because he said he was the Son of God and because he blasphemed. But when they go to Pilate, they don't say that's the charge. They say that he is stirring up the people and that he is making himself out to be a king. And the reason why they say that, as opposed to saying that he is blaspheming their God, is because that would not have drawn the ire of the Roman governor. He's not caring about what they do among themselves concerning their own religion. But whenever they say he is making himself out to be a king, then he becomes a threat to Caesar. And you're wanting to say that because he's a threat to Caesar, you have an obligation to have him crucified. Even though Pilate interviews him and sees he is no threat whatsoever. He even goes back and asks him, are you a king? And he says, I am. But my kingdom is not of this world. If it was, my disciples would fight. But they're not going to fight because my kingdom is not of this world, which tells Pilate he has nothing to worry about. He's not there to threaten Caesar's throne. He's not there to threaten Pilate's position. He's not even there to threaten the garrison, the Roman garrison that's built there. And all the Jews truly anticipated when Messiah was going to come, he was going to lead a charge against Fort Antonio that was built right next to the temple. And he was going to start there. He was going to defeat the soldiers that were there. He was going to defeat them. And from there was going to begin the great revolt that would lead to worldwide dominion. But instead of Jesus going and attacking the Roman garrison, when Jesus comes into the city, the first place he goes to the temple. He attacks the temple. He turns over the money changers' tables, and he turns over the cages and the pens where they have the sacrifice that they're selling for business. And he says, you turned my father's house into a house of merchandise. And then he gives that great passage in Matthew 23, and one after another, he exposes the hypocrisy of the religious leadership of Israel. He doesn't do one thing against the Romans, but he comes with his house, with his own house, the house of Israel. This is not what they thought was on the agenda. This is not their view of Messiah. To the extent that Pilate, after even interviewing Jesus, says, I find no fault in this man. He saw no threat against Rome. He saw no threat, but that was the charge. They threatened to take it to Caesar. Pilate had already had issues with them that they had gone to Caesar, and each one of those issues he had lost ground. He didn't want to be taken back to task over something else. And so he acquiesced, and even though he pronounces him innocent, he commands that he be scourged and crucified. And so what does he write as far as his crime is concerned? He writes on that placard, this is Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. That's his crime. Well, that doesn't fit well with the leadership there. Verse 21, it says, I'm back in John 19. So the chief priests of the Jews were saying to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am King of the Jews. So the chief priests, they come to Pilate, they say, no, don't put on there that he's King of the Jews. Put on there that he said he was King of the Jews. Pilate says this. Pilate answered, what I have written, and I am not going to change it. I don't think this set well at all with the leadership. I really, truly don't. This is exactly the opposite. They don't want it stated that he is king. Now, why did Pilate say that? Why wouldn't Pilate find it more appropriate to say he said he is king? Why does he put up there Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews? What purpose is serving? I think he's been put in a corner. He is miserably doing something against his own will. I think he is getting back at those Jewish leaders. And in the very fact that he uses the phrase or the term Jesus Nazarene is indicative of that. Because everybody knows that Nazareth is the lowest community that there is in Jerusalem. Nazareth was the place where when Philip came to Nathanael and said, "We have found the Messiah, and he is a Nazarene," Nathanael's response was, "Any good thing come out of Nazareth." Almost always, not always, but almost always in the Gospels, when the term Nazarene is used, it's used by the Jews. It's used by the Jews in reference of Jesus. And the reason why they use it is to demean Jesus, not just to explain where Jesus is from. It's a derogatory connection to Nazareth. Well, don't you remember what we read in Philippians chapter 2, that he left his holy estate and he took on the form of a man. He humbled himself by taking on the form of a man, and he became as a slave. Everything about Christ is all wrapped around humility. He is, even in his early upbringing, even though he fulfilled scripture by being born in Bethlehem, he's not known as Jesus of Bethlehem. He's known as Jesus of Nazareth. Even though Bethlehem is the city of David, which has a tremendous past history and honorable, only 8 miles outside of the city of Jerusalem. His connection is not with Bethlehem. His connection is with Nazareth. I believe God intended it to be that way. I believe God wanted to produce the greatest humility that could be produced of Jesus Christ. Even in his death, he is associated with criminals. He has one criminal on each side of him, and he's placed chiefly in the middle. That's another interesting fact, that the middle person, when there was a trio of those crucified, it would be the middle person that would be considered to be the chief criminal that would be placed there. So this is even further humiliation that he has. And that's why Paul says in Philippians 2 that he submitted himself to death, even the death on a cross, which is the lowest, most humiliating form of punishment that they could devise. So everything about him is humiliation. Pilate is not recognizing Jesus as the king. He's not saying Jesus as the king in his own heart. He's doing this now to chide those Jews. And what he's doing is he's had him beaten. He's had him bloodied. He's had him stripped naked. He's had him suspended between heaven and earth. And he's saying, "This is your king, a Nazarene. This is what you have as a king," and he's mocking the whole nation. Exactly what he's doing there. But what he is also doing is he is honoring Jesus Christ. Not willfully, not knowingly, but he is honoring Jesus Christ. You remember the story of Balaam and Barak in the Old Testament? Does that sound familiar to anybody? Anybody know who Balaam was?
God.
He was the prophet that was rebuked by his own donkey. I don't know of any other case in the Bible where an animal talks other than in the garden when the serpent spoke to Eve. That's the only other time I know of an animal speaking. In this case, it was a donkey that began to speak to the prophet. And the reason why the donkey was speaking to the prophet is because the prophet was not going where he should have been going. He was going to a king whose name was Barak, who was one of the kings of the people of the area where the wilderness, where the wanderings of the Jews, the Israelites during the wilderness would travel. In their wilderness wanderings, they conquered many people. They subdued many people. There were many wars that took place in the 40 years' time. And in those wars, Israel subdued the people that they came in contact with. And this became known among all the people there. They knew what had happened in Egypt, how God had humbled Egypt by 10 plagues before they left Egypt. They knew what they did everywhere they went. And Barak was smart enough to know that God was the reason why the Jews were as successful as they were. So he took it upon himself. He thought, before they come into our territory, into our dominion, I'm going to go get a prophet of this God, and I'm going to pay that prophet to curse these people so that their God cannot give them victory over us. And he offered Balaam, and by the way, Balaam was a prophet. That's what's so amazing. He was a prophet of God. In fact, some of the prophecies that Balaam gave pertain to the first coming of Jesus Christ. Some of the greatest prophecies pertaining to the first coming of Christ came out of Balaam's mouth. But they came out when he went to go and curse the people. Do you remember? Barak took him, positioned him in different places where he could see the encampment from a high hill of Israel, put Balaam there, had Balaam sacrifice some sacrifices, make some sacrifices to God, and to go and to curse them. And when he went to curse them, out of his mouth came blessings. And it's those blessings that are not only blessing the people, but are also prophetic utterances of the first coming of Jesus Christ. Amazing, isn't it? So Barak took Balaam to another place. After he looked at him and said, I'm paying you to curse them, and you're blessing them. And he says, you don't understand. This is what God is putting in me. I got to speak what God says. He says, so let's go to another place. They go to another place. They get up on another high hill. And he says, now curse them, after going through some more sacrifices, killing some more animals, burning them on an altar. He then proceeds to curse them. Out comes a blessing. Over and over again, finally they're exasperated. Balaam goes his way, Barak goes his way. The end of Balaam, he is reduced to a witch. He is reduced to a fortune teller. He is as far from God as could be. But even wicked Balaam, when it came to fulfilling God, could not speak a curse against God's people. And I think this is very indicative of what is said here when it says, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. Pilate may have meant it to be mockery. He may have meant it to be cursing, but instead it is a validation. This is another fact that was there at the cross that still stands out. Isn't it beautiful? Christ is not going to be diminished, even by the most wicked participants there at the crucifixion. So, going back to Matthew 27, we continue in this study. What man intended evil, God intends. See if I can light my cigar. So, verse 38, right after they put the placard up there, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews, verse 38. At that time, 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those passing by were hurling abuse at him, their heads, and saying, you who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. Now, I want to stop right there, and I want to look at that. So he was placed between 2 thieves. In verse 44, if you skip on down to verse 44, it says this, the robbers who had been crucified also insulting him with the same words. John mentions the robbers, when Matthew mentions the thieves, the robbers, and when Mark mentions them, it only mentions them as thieves and robbers. What's really interesting, though, is Luke's account of this is the only one that's different. Go to Luke chapter 23. In Luke chapter 23, verse 39. It says, one of the criminals who were hanged there was hurling abuse at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other answered and rebuking him said, "Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he was saying, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." Interesting, because Matthew and Mark says that they were both hurling insults at Jesus. Some have suggested that the plural there is a tricky plural when it says they were both, there's a plural word referring to both of them that could have also been indicative of just a singular person. I kind of take the idea that both of them started out insulting. Both of them had the same attitude, but at some point in time, one of their attitude begins to change. Starts to see what is going on. And I believe, again, it's because of the light of Jesus Christ permeating the dark blackness that surrounds them. They're put on a cross with Jesus. They're suffering the same humiliation. They're suffering the same agony. I don't know if they're suffering as cruelly as Jesus had suffered, probably not. But they're still in horrific pain and torment. While one of the criminals, and we don't know who these criminals were. We don't even know for certain that they were Jewish, though they probably could have been. Most likely were, but we do know this. They were suffering. They were hurling insults. And one of them says to Jesus, "Are you the Christ?" Which makes me think they're either Jewish or know something of the Jewish religion from that very statement, "Are you the Christ?" What's it? One of the criminals says specifically in verse 39 of Luke 23, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." Basically saying, if you're the Christ, then come down from the cross, save us also. And that's really a logical statement. That's really a logical statement. Because if he's the Christ, if you're the one sent by God, if you have the power of God, if you've performed miracles of healing, if you've stopped the storms from being storms to absolute tranquility, if you've demonstrated this kind of power, then why are you here on the cross? That doesn't make sense. And if you are the Christ, come down from the cross. Now, they're not just saying, come down from the cross. Come down and take us with you. He's literally saying, if you are what you say and what has been said of you, then this is to be the proof positive. Because by all means, if you're the Christ, you should not be suffering this kind of pain, agony, and humiliation, number one. And if you can bring yourself down, then you can bring us down with you. He's basically saying, we'll believe you. You come down, we'll be your followers. Just take us with you. When he says, bring us down with you, he's basically saying, I'll commit myself to you. I'm yours. Just get me off this cross. Here's a guy that's really dealing well with God. A lot of people that deal with God, a lot of times on their deathbed, or a lot of times in a critical situation. God, if you get me out of this situation, I'll follow you. 99% of the time, that doesn't happen. I do believe that occasionally it might, but for the most part, foxhole conversions generally don't take after the bullets stop flying overhead. But when you're in that foxhole, you're likely to make all kinds of promises, but those promises are generally based on this. Get me out of this situation, and then I will do this, this, and this for you. Which means, if you don't get me out of this situation, you're losing a good soul. you're really missing a great opportunity. The only requirement that I have is save me from this situation. Get me out of here. Just like this man said, if you're the cross, are you the Christ? Come down from the cross and take us with you. So this is a dealing that is totally conditional on the fact that they're going to get their desire met. They're going to get their needs met immediately. Immediate needs is going to bring about immediate discipleship. This is not unlike another time in which the same thing is posed to Jesus at the very beginning of his ministry. Immediately after he had been baptized by John, he went into the wilderness, and there it says he fasted for 40 days, and afterwards he was hungry. That's interesting. I've done some study about fasting. I've done some study about what is involved in that. And when a person goes on a long fast, first week, 2 weeks, they may experience real hunger pains. I mean, you know, you start feeling it after you've missed the first couple of meals. And it intensifies, and for a while, that's all you can think about is food and wanting to get fed. But after, sometimes as little as just a few days, 3 or 4 days, sometimes as long as a week or 2 weeks, that hunger subsides. No longer feel, oh, you'd like to eat. Food still smells real good, but you don't have that same hunger pain that was bothering you for that time. And your body literally goes into a type of hibernation or dormancy, and it's feeding off of the fat resources, and you're no longer having the severe hunger pains you started with. That's interesting. The way that they say that you know you must break your fast and start eating again is when you start feeling the hunger pains the second time. That is true hunger. That's true starvation. I mean, you're not starving while you still got all those fat resources stored up in your body. You may go 40 days, you may go a month, you may go 6 weeks, you may go longer. But whenever you're finally depleted of all your natural reserves, then the body starts feeding on the internal organs, the muscle, and the protein in the body. And at that time, starvation starts doing severe damage to the body. And if you don't start eating soon after you feel, and by the way, when the second hunger pains come, they say it is much more intense, much more severe than those initial hunger pains that you felt at the beginning of the fast. It's horrific hunger pains when you go into true starvation. That's when people will eat their shoes. That's when people will do almost anything because they are going into starvation. You remember the times in the Old Testament where it talks about like the city of Samaria that was under siege and they were going through starvation, and women were eating their own children? That's how severe the starvation had gotten into. So when he says Satan came to him, Jesus had fasted 40 days and he was hungry, tells us that he had already used up his reserves, and now he is suffering intense hunger pains. And that's when Satan shows up. He doesn't show up until Jesus is in absolute distress. Vulnerable. Vulnerable. What does he say to him? What is the first thing he says to him? He says, if you are the Son of God. The same thing that this thief is saying. Are you not the Christ? Then why are you suffering like this? Why are you tormenting yourself like this? If you're the Christ, you can come down from the cross. Satan said, if you are the Christ, turn these stones into bread. Jesus said, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone. Every temptation. Immediately after Satan's visitation, it says the angels came and ministered to him. You know what? I believe the angels came and fed him like the angels fed Elijah when he was at the brook Cherith. Probably had angel food cake, but he had something to eat immediately after, because this is now the depletion. He's waiting on God to feed him, as opposed to him taking it upon himself to act out as God when he is already set aside and he has emptied himself. And he is now here as dependent on God as any one of us would be dependent on God. And he is not going to take and make those stones into bread, though he could do so. He's going to wait on the Father, and the Father will send him what he needs. Here is the same question. Are you not the Christ? If you are, save yourself. It was equivalent to what Satan said. Turn these stones into bread for yourself. Take care of yourself. By all means, Jesus, use your deity for your needs. You know, I don't know that Christ's miracles ever benefited him. I'm not sure that he even partook of the loaves and the fishes when he multiplied them, because at the end, when the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls, and that's what they had for themselves, note there were 13 in that group. I don't believe Jesus even took it all. I believe he just left there hungry that day. That's my guess. Because I don't believe he came here for his miracles to benefit him. I believe he came here for his miracles to benefit us. I believe he endured humiliation, and I believe he denied himself even the simple eating of the bread that he had miraculously proven. Proven not only to Satan, but everybody else, hey, I can take and I can multiply. He said, take these stones, turn them into bread. I can make one little fish, and I can make it feed thousands. He had that power, even there when he was in the wilderness with Satan. And so we see that. Now these criminals, it's interesting because it says in Matthew's account, he is placed between the two criminals. And in Matthew's account, verse 44, they both hurled insults on Jesus. They are hurling insults. They are adding to the wickedness of that moment. At some point in time, however, one of these criminals starts to see. You know, I have to believe that he is seeing the majesty of Christ being demonstrated there on the cross. He may even look up and read that placard there and see what it says, King of the Jews, because the one thing he says to Jesus, he says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I honestly believe this is the most amazing salvation experience that takes place in the entire Bible. It's more amazing than the salvation of the woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery. I think it's even more amazing than it was when Paul was converted on the road to Damascus, when he instantaneously goes from being a persecutor of the church to a preacher of the church. I believe this is even more dramatic and more amazing. Because you think about this. The man is dying. And he knows he's about to meet God. What is that man going to attempt to do? If he truly believes there is a God, he truly believes he's about to meet that God, and he's about to give a reckoning, or he's going to come to a reckoning. He's going to have to explain his life. He's going to have to stand up and give account for his life. What do you think a man does on his deathbed?
If he has the time.
If he has the time. This man has the time. What does he do on his deathbed when he has the time? And he knows he's a criminal. He knows he's a sinner. He knows he has lived a life of selfishness. He has abused people. And he's about to give account before God. What does a man who believes that there is a God he's going to account to, what do they do? Ask for mercy. Repent. What else? Maybe he calls in family members or people that he's wronged if he's got the time. He asks for their forgiveness, or he tries to do something direct. Whatever he can. The one thing he does, he wants to make sure he's got something he can take with him to heaven. The last thing that the man wants to do is anything that offends the God he is about to go and stand with. Wouldn't you safely say that? Doesn't want to add any more offenses to that. What is this thief that turns to Jesus? What happens to this man? Let me tell you, there is nothing, humanly speaking, other than Christ's own nature and his own benevolence and his own restraint from defending himself, acting out against his accusers. Nothing other than that. Everything else is indicative that this man is a fake. This man is a liar. This man is false. This man is dying on a cross because he has violated everything about God. He is there because God has put him there. He is there because he has blasphemed. He is there because he's not the true Messiah. Even the other thief says, if you are the Christ, then come down from the cross. Prove it. When we go back to Matthew and we see the statements that are being made by everybody. Look, go to Matthew 27, verse 39. And those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads and saying, you who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. They're saying the same thing. Come down from the cross. Save yourself. And what are they saying? You who said, I will destroy the temple and in 3 days rebuild it. What are they saying there? Did Jesus ever say anything like that? Yes, he did. Did he say that? No, he didn't. What did he say? I'm glad you asked. Go to John chapter 2. John chapter 2, verse 18. The Jews then said to him, what sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things? What are the things he was doing? He had gone in the first time to cleanse the temple. He was a nobody. He was without authority. He did not have a position. He was not from the Sanhedrin. He was not an official. He was just a man from Nazareth who came in and saw what they were doing, and that they were turning the Father's house into a place of business, and the first overturning of the temple. He had gone in, it says he made, in verse 15, or verse 13, the Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. And he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned the tables. And to those who were selling the doves, he said, take these things away, stop making my Father's house a place of business. And so in verse 18, the Jews, note that the Jews do not say he did anything wrong. What was going on was wrong. They don't try to defend what was happening. They just say, by what authority do you have the right to come in here and do this? What position? And what they say this is interesting. The Jews then said to him, what sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews then said, it took 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days. But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken. Jesus was not saying I will destroy this temple and in 3 days raise it up. In fact, he didn't say, I will even destroy this body. He said, you destroy this temple, this body, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And what is that? That's the sign. They asked specifically, what is the sign of the authority that gives you the right to do these things? Going back now, it says in verse 40, and saying, you who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. They're saying, if you're the Son of God, then the sign will be, you're going to come down from the cross. No, Jesus said, the sign will be, I will raise up 3 days later. They don't have the patience to wait 3 days, and they're saying, no, the sign will be, you'll be on the cross, you'll come down from the cross, and they will believe. Jesus said, I'll give you a sign, but it'll be 3 days later, and the only sign I'll give you is the resurrection. But they're saying, that's right. Jonah was 3 days in the belly of the fish. Son of Man will be 3 days in the tomb. That's right, the only sign. Not only do they say, if you're the Son of God, come down from the cross, in verse 41, in the same way, the chief priests also along with the scribes and elders were mocking him and saying, he saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him now come down from the cross. And we will believe. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him. Now, if he delights in him, for he said, I am the Son of God. Now we have another group. We had the two thieves on the cross that were next to him. They were reviling him with insults. We have the passers-by that would be passing by, especially on this day in which they were preparing for the Passover. And they are mocking him. And they're saying, you who said you could destroy this temple, then if you'll come down from the cross, why don't you come down from the cross since you can rebuild it in 3 days? They're mocking him. And then finally we have the religious elite. Note it says that in verse 41 that the chief priests also along with the scribes and the elders. This is basically everybody. This is the full Sanhedrin there that is made up of the priests, the scribes, the elders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. Why are they there? This is not a common place for them to be. This is not a likely place to find them, and yet they're there at the cross. Why do you suppose they're there at the cross?
So the crime that he committed.
Yeah, remember how he laid into them and woe unto? You know what's so interesting about that? Let's go to Matthew 23. In that passage, we have all of these woes, all of these depictions of what it is, and he is unmercifully, or it appears unmercifully, lambasting the reputations of these leaders of Israel. Verse 37. Immediately after having said everything he said to them, he said this, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. Often I wanted to gather your children together the way and gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you from now on, you will not, from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Note to these people that he has just laid into his mercy, his compassion, his heart is towards them. He says how often I wanted to gather. He's not just speaking to the few, he's speaking to the whole nation, including those religious leaders. If you go to Acts chapter 6, an interesting statement. In Acts chapter 6, verse 7. The word of God kept on spreading, and the number of the disciples continued to increase greatly in Jerusalem. And a great many of the priests were becoming obedient to the faith. These same priests that were the object of Christ's derision, many of them were coming to the faith. Because though he spoke of impending judgment on them, though he spoke of the wrath of God that was due them, though he exposed them for the hypocrisy that they were, the hypocrites that they were, he did it out of love, mercy, and grace. Even to the extent that after his death, after the church is established, we find a great, it doesn't say a few of the priests, it says a great number of the priests were becoming obedient to them. You see, what Jesus did should not have evoked vengeance from their hearts, because he didn't do it with animosity. He didn't do it to hurt them. He exposed them to sin. They have no business being there extracting vengeance from one who is only loving them by telling them the truth. What were you going to say?
I have read it and sometimes have thought about it, that when you talk about what is a person dying in the bed do, times like back. Well, I wonder if that, gee, I remember what they said, I wonder. You know, I almost sometimes think and wonder in my own mind if some of those people that came to the cross come back and say, well, maybe it is.
Yeah.
And we go back and check again out of, whether it's out of curiosity, fear, or whatever else it is, to go back and see, because we as humans are looking for the facts.
That's right.
Of prove this time. And yet, some of these people going there, I feel like that some of the people that were there because they were having a sense about them that there's something different about this.
It could be. The only problem, though, is the Bible doesn't tell us that.
I understand.
See, that's the only problem. What the Bible does tell us is that everybody that was there, that is spoken of, and I'm not saying they weren't there. I'm not saying that your thoughts aren't true. I'm just saying there's nothing there to say that they were there.
I know that.
That's the problem. The only thing that we have is like Mary was there, John was there. They were sympathetic to Christ. There were women that wept, that were along the way, and Jesus said, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves. Remember, he said that. So there were some sympathetic. And I guess in that sense, the Bible does say that there were some sympathetic people. But by the very fact that the overwhelming majority must have been in this venue, is because it's what is really looked at, especially in Matthew's. I guess, I just talked myself into a circle, because by saying that there were women, there was John, there was Mary that was at the cross, because at the cross it was Jesus that said to John, this is your mother, and to Mary, this is your son, and committed to him the care for Mary to Jesus. So there were that. But it seems, though, that the overwhelming majority must have been. Weren't there? Because remember, he says he looked for sympathy, quoting back Psalm 69, and there was none. And gall to drink and vinegar to drink was to be found there. So those sympathetic few were probably so overruled in their voice and in their tears by the screaming, crying, animosity of the crowds that they seem to be as not there in Christ. That was what we read earlier, and it says, the reproach has broken my heart. I am so sick, and I looked for sympathy, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none. They also gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst, they gave me vinegar to drink. So the overwhelming majority must have been there to bring anguish to Christ. We see that. Now, it's interesting. The passers-by They speak directly to Jesus. They're the ones that say, you who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross. In the same way, the chief priests, also along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him and saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now. He delights in him, for he said, I am the Son of God. Notice that not one of them are speaking directly to Jesus. None of the statements that the scribes and the leaders speak is directly to Jesus. It's to one another, or is to others there in the scene there. Why are they not speaking to Jesus? The passerby spoke directly to Jesus. Why are they speaking about him and not speaking to him? Why are they even there? I mean, this is the meaning for their office, their business, their position to be seen in places. Why do they find it's important for them to be there?
They want to bolster the fact of what they've done. In other words, they want to continually discredit him.
They want to continue to discredit him because there's something there at the cross they don't like. What is it they don't like at the cross? What does the sign say? And what do they say? They say, he is the King of Israel. They're saying, not if, they're saying he is the King of Israel because that's what the sign says. They are there to explain away the sign. They are there to make sure nobody at the cross reads the sign and misunderstands. They're doing damage control. They are putting their spin on it, and they're not talking to Jesus, they're talking to everybody there. And they're saying, the sign says he's king. Okay, if he is king, it says he is the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross. And we will believe in him. So in other words, they're putting a condition. Pilate wouldn't put on that placard, he said he was King of the Jews. Pilate said, what I have written. So they've got to go there and explain away why that placard says King of the Jews. And they're saying, okay, it says up there, King of the Jews. But if he's King of the Jews, he wouldn't be on the cross. If he's King of the Jews, he can come down. And if he comes down, even we that have accused him, abused him, maligned him, we will follow him. And what they're saying is, because he doesn't come down from the cross, then he cannot be the king. And they're making sure that nobody, they are so afraid of that sign that they don't want even the slightest person coming away thinking, then they are working overtime to discredit him further. And notice this. It says, he saved others. He cannot save himself. He had resurrected. He had healed the blind. They don't argue the miracles. They know the miracles were true. They gave credence that the miracles came from Satan. Remember, they said he cast out demons by the power of Beelzebub, chief of the demons. So they say, he saved others, he cannot save himself. The fact of the matter is, because he saves, he would not save himself. He could have always come down from the cross. He could have called the 12 legion of angels and come down from the cross. He could have, by his own power, come down from the cross. It wasn't that he could not come down, he would not come down from the cross. And that's again why that I think that that one lone thief up there who turns to Jesus and says, remember me when you come into your kingdom, because this man has front row seats. He's been given the privilege of being right there. He hears everything in his own ears. He hears the credentialed leaders of Israel acknowledge that he cannot possibly, unless he comes down from the cross, possibly be the king. The leadership of Israel, the spiritual backbone of Israel, all of this has professed him to be anything but the king. Burns him. Now, if I was dying and I didn't want to offend God, and all of the people representing God was there saying one thing, I would find it very difficult to spit in God's eye by turning to a known criminal and saying, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I don't think I would want that to be the last words on my mouth, out of my mouth, when I died and was about to meet this God that was most likely the one that was causing this man to die, because he must surely be a sinner. But to cut through all of that garbage, all of that lying, all of that discrediting of Jesus Christ, and to see past it and to see that this man, in spite of the fact that there are no endorsements whatsoever coming his way, I'm going to hang all that I have, and I'm going to turn my mercy to this one man, because I truly believe he is king. He says, when you, not if you come into your kingdom, when you come into your kingdom, remember me. Note that Jesus was placed in the middle between the two. And how fitting, because in all reality, he is taking the position of a judge. When criminals are presented before the judge, and it doesn't say, it just says one was to the right and the other to the left of Jesus. It doesn't say which one was on the right, which one was on the left, but something tells me that the good guy was on the right. Because he says in the 25th chapter of Matthew, at the end of when he comes back and sets up his kingdom, he's going to separate the sheep from the goats. And the goats are going to go to the left, and they're going to be destroyed, and the sheep are going to go to the right, and they're going to inhabit the kingdom. So I have to believe that this judge that is there on the cross is making judgment. He says to the one on his right, where the one on the left dies cursed. I'd rather believe that he had more hope with God lining himself up with the leaders of Israel than he would with this bleeding, bloody, dying man on the cross. That to me makes the thief on the cross one of the most unlikely people on earth to come to Christ. It was at the worst possible moment for Christ. And yet, the worst moment, think of this. This was the moment Satan had been craving to put him in the worst possible light, but it doesn't stop the power of the Holy Spirit to penetrate the darkness and to bring to man, a man who was not religious, a man who was not godly, a man who has not ever lived a life that was exemplary in any degree, the absolute truth, and give him the ability to utter out those words that sustained him, that kept him, and that keeps him to this day as a living, breathing follower of Christ. Never ever think that darkness, depth of darkness, the horror of darkness, or if the whole world gains together in unity, will ever diminish the ability of God to reach into this world and still save sinners. We're living in a very dark world, but this is a time that we ought to be looking for revival. And I'm not talking about revival in the spirituals, you float around. I'm talking about revival in which people are coming to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. We need to quit thinking that we're heavy laden with darkness, and remember that the light shines brighter the darker it gets. Thief on the cross, a centurion at the foot of the cross. Still saving in spite of the horror and wickedness that surrounds him. Any thoughts or questions about any of this tonight?
I'll look at the facts. my feeling is that he has heard all the facts, yet not only what he has been, the Spirit had been led to, but he was the one who demonstrated faith.
Yeah.
What we have today, we don't have the facts, we have faith. One of the life had faith. Okay, because as you said, why would you reach out to everybody saying he's a criminal and yet turn to him and say, remember me this day?
Yeah. That's an amazing faith,
Because
isn't
of
it?
faith. Very faith.
That's,
And it is an example that one of the reasons it is written is an example for us to follow in that even in the darkest times, turn to faith.
you know, we think about the fact that this man dies that day. He doesn't get to have a lot of fruit. I think this man's fruit is far greater than many people that have served God for 50, 60 years of their life. Just all condensed in that one moment. I think he'll have great fruit based on that. The fact that he comes to Christ against so, I mean, he is like a salmon that is swimming upstream against a torrent, and he makes it. The likely person to come to Christ. Should have been like the other thief, but he didn't. He'll have fruit. Ken, any thoughts?
That's amazing love, right?
It is.
I was thinking of the old hymn.
Amen.
Amazing love, how can it be?
What's that?
Isn't that amazing love, how can it be?
Yeah,
That thou, my God, would die for me?
that's right.
He has an amazing love. And he had an amazing love for that man on the cross.
Amen. Amen.
Well, I've got to believe that both of these thieves knew about Jesus. I mean, you couldn't live around Jerusalem and not know all that he was doing.
Right.
His reputation was being spread all over. So these guys could have, but you have one on the left, as you said, still came from almost the same framework that the Jewish leaders.
It's true.
And he challenged Jesus on the cross. But the other one, I've got to believe, wow, saw all these things, he finally came to the place of realizing, you know, hey guys, you and I are up here because of what we've done. This guy hadn't done anything.
That's right.
This guy's innocent. And if he's doing what he's doing and hearing all of what Jesus is saying, I don't know where in the framework of the timing that came where Jesus spoke to Mary and John, it had to affect this guy. And like you said, Jesus wasn't spouting out any venom or anything. It was all compassion. And that had to reach to his heart where he then confessed, I'm guilty. You're guilty.
Yeah,
This guy's not.
that's right.
The hope that I need. Now put my hope in him.
Amen.
Good lesson.
All right.